All right, so now we're gonna work with a problem, and we're gonna identify what type of domain problem this is, what rule that we're gonna have to follow, and then how we are going to solve and put this into interval notation. So if we're working with f of t is equal to 5t divided by t cubed minus 16t. So let's say this is the function that we're working with. So the first thing that I recommend doing, especially like if you have those rules that I talked about in the last video memorized, or if you kind of are familiar with those, the first thing that I think that you guys should do is, for step one, just kind of like basically identifying what type of domain problem this is, meaning out of all 5 of them, which type this is. So this would fit into our domain rule number 2. And so we're going to solve this by setting the bottom of the equation so that it is not equal to 0. So the second step that you're going to follow is you're actually going to set the bottom of the equation equal to 0, and then you're going to solve to find what will make the bottom 0, and then you're going to exclude those values. So we're just going to take this part of the equation. We don't need that 5t, so we're going to take t cubed minus 16t equal to 0. And then, so for this, the best way to do this would be taking a t out of the equation, or out of this, and then putting it into parentheses. So you would do t squared minus 16 is equal to 0. So you can kind of take this t value first, because you're working with the domain. You know that you're going to have a t not equal to 0, and then we're going to take this inner part and then keep working with that. All right, so now that we solved the equation and we found what values of t, if we were to plug these values into the equation, that it would make the denominator equal to 0. So we have to make sure to exclude those from our domain. Since we have those values written out here, the way that I kind of like to look at these problems is, instead of just immediately working with excluding the values, kind of taking the fact that if your values were represented as negative infinity to infinity, so if you were working with all real numbers, out of these numbers, what do you exclude, or how do you write it so that you make sure that you're including the 4 little exclusions in order to make your domain valid? So we're starting with the set all real numbers, and so with that set of all real numbers, we're going to add in each one of those little exclusions that we came up with on our list to make sure that we're writing our domain so that it's excluding the values that would set our denominator equal to 0. So what we're first going to have, so we have that negative infinity, and then just to write it out here, we have 0, we have -4, 0, and 4. So the first value that we have is -4. And then for this problem, we're going to use parentheses And the reason that we're using parentheses is because the parentheses excludes that for value, because that would be an open circle. If we wanted to include that negative 4, so if we wanted negative 4 to be a part of the domain, we would use a bracket, because that's the closed circle, and that shows that negative 4 is included in the value of the domain. So that's the reason that you would use the parentheses for a problem like this, is because you want to make sure that you're setting that negative 4 to be excluded from the domain, and that's what that parenthesis does. So that's the first part that we're doing. And so now we're going to continue union. So now next, when we're fitting all these exclusions into our number line of negative infinity to infinity, next we're going to have the union of negative 4 to 0. And then you have 0 to 4. And then you have 4 to infinity. So the reason that we write it like this is because what you want to make sure that you're including is when you're doing, if you wrote it as, say, negative infinity, comma, negative 4, union 0, comma, 4, comma, infinity, because sometimes I feel like it's kind of easy to make a mistake like this, because what you want to make sure that you're doing is that you're not forgetting to include the values that are between the things that you're excluding. So when you have these numbers like negative 4, 0, and 4, you want to make sure that you're including, you're not just doing negative 4 to 0 and then 0 to 4 without making sure that you're including everything that goes in between those numbers. So sometimes I've seen problems where people will do, they'll have 3 of them, and then you don't remember to include that you have to do a union between those numbers. So say your number was say we were just doing x squared minus 16 equals 0. Say we were just working with this value, and then what you would end up getting is x equals plus or minus 4. So how this would look with interval notation, I'm going to change the color just to show that we're kind of working on an outside part of this. What you would have is you would have negative infinity to negative 4, union negative 4 to 4, union 4 to infinity. Because sometimes how I've seen it written is that people forget that negative 4 to 4, and then what you end up having is negative infinity to negative 4, union 4 to infinity. So then you're actually, by doing that, you're excluding negative 3, negative 2, negative 1, 0. You're excluding all the values that go in the middle. So make sure that you're paying attention to when you have a certain number of things that you have to exclude from the domain, make sure you're paying attention to everything that needs to be shown in order to make sure that you're not excluding any values outside of what needs to be excluded, and you're not taking out any numbers by accident. So if you have 3 numbers that need to be excluded from the domain in a problem like this, you're going to have 4 sets of parentheses. Hopefully that makes sense, and then I'm going to do a couple more videos explaining how to go over things like this for you guys.